In 1925, a man walked into one of the finest hotels in Paris with a plan that sounds completely ridiculous. He was going to try to sell the Eiffel Tower. There was only one small problem though. He didn't own it, he didn't work for the French government, he didn't have permission to sell it. And the Eiffel Tower wasn't even for sale. But somehow he found a buyer. He convinced the man that the French government was secretly trying to tear down one of the most famous structures in the world. He collected the money, then he disappeared. And you would think that's where the story ends, but it's not. Because after getting away with it, he came back to Paris and tried to sell it again. This is the story of one of the most fascinating con men in history. But more importantly, it's a story about something every entrepreneur, investor, and businessman should absolutely understand. People don't make financial decisions based on what something actually is. They make decisions based on what they think it could be worth. And Victor Lustig understood that better than anybody. Victor Lustig was born in 1890 in what was then Austria-Hungary, in an area that is now part of the Czech Republic. And from an early age, Lustig discovered something important. He was good with people, like very good. He reportedly spoke multiple languages, he dressed really well, and he carried himself like somebody important. But most importantly, he understood human behavior. Lustig wasn't the stereotypical criminal. He wasn't kicking down doors, he wasn't robbing banks with a gun. His weapon was confidence. In fact, that's where we get the term confidence man. A con man doesn't necessarily take your money. He convinces you to give it to him. And Lustig became a master of it. He eventually began traveling around Europe and America, reportedly working scams aboard luxury ocean liners. Think about the environment for a second. This was before the internet, before Google, before you could pull out your phone and search somebody's name. You're aboard a luxury ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. A sophisticated European gentleman approaches you. He's well dressed, he speaks intelligently, he understands business, and maybe he tells you that he's a count or a duke or something. Maybe an investor, maybe a businessman. How exactly do you verify his story? You can't. And Lustig understood that. The world was becoming more connected, but information was still extremely difficult to verify. And wherever information is difficult to verify, there's an opportunity for somebody to exploit that gap. And Lustig did exactly that. He allegedly ran a gambling scheme, fake investment opportunities, and one of his most famous scams involved something sometimes called a money box. The machine supposedly had the ability to duplicate currency. According to versions of the story, Lustig would show his targets a mystery box. He'd place a real bill inside, and then he'd explain that the machine needed several hours to chemically reproduce the note. Eventually, another genuine bill would appear. The victim thought that they had just witnessed a machine print money. So what do you think happened next? Greed took over. People were willing to pay enormous amounts of money for the machine, and Lustig would sell it and then disappear. Eventually, the buyer would realize that the only real money coming out of the box was the currency that Lustig had already planted inside it beforehand. But by then, he was long gone. And that tells us something important about his scams. Lustig wasn't really selling machines. He wasn't selling investments. And then later, he wasn't really selling the Eiffel Tower. He was selling something much more powerful. Opportunity. So fast forward to 1925, now he's in Paris. The Eiffel Tower had been standing for more than 3 decades at this point. Today we think of the Eiffel Tower as inseparable from Paris, but that wasn't always the case. When the tower was constructed for the 1889 World's Fair, it was very controversial. Some artists and intellectuals hated it. And importantly for Lustig's scheme, the tower had originally been associated with a temporary concession. By the 1920s, maintaining the enormous iron structure was expensive. Then Lustig reportedly came across newspaper coverage discussing the tower's maintenance problems, and something clicked. Most people reading an article about expensive maintenance would think, that's interesting. But Victor Lustig apparently thought, I wonder if I can sell it. And that's exactly what he set out to do. But here's where the brilliance of the con begins. Lustig didn't put an ad in the newspaper saying, Eiffel Tower for sale, because nobody would believe that. Instead, he manufactured exclusivity. Lustig reportedly obtained information about major scrap metal dealers operating in Paris. Then several of those businessmen received official-looking invitations. They were invited to a confidential meeting at one of Paris's finest hotels. Imagine receiving that letter. You're a successful businessman. The government apparently wants to discuss something privately. And when you arrive, You're introduced to an elegant government official, except he isn't really a government official. That's Victor Lustig. Lustig reportedly presented himself as a representative of the French government. Then he explained why they had been summoned. The Eiffel Tower was going to be demolished, and the government wanted to sell that massive amount of metal as scrap. Now stop for a second. Think about what that opportunity would mean to a scrap metal businessman. The Eiffel Tower contains thousands of tons of iron. This wasn't some pile of metal sitting behind a warehouse. This was one of the largest metal structures in Europe. And if you believe the story, the contract could be worth a fortune. But Lustig knew that there was an obvious question. Why hadn't anybody heard about this? So he answered it before they could ask. The government wanted secrecy. Imagine the embarrassment. Imagine the public reaction if people discovered that officials were considering demolishing the Eiffel Tower. So the bidders were told that everything had to remain confidential. And this is one of the most important elements of the entire scam, because secrecy didn't make the story less believable. Secrecy made it even more believable. If the businessman couldn't find anything about the sale in the newspaper, well, of course they couldn't. It's a secret. If their colleagues hadn't heard about it, of course they hadn't. It's a secret. If they were told not to discuss it with anyone, that wasn't suspicious. It supposedly proved how important the deal was. Lustig had created a situation where the lack of evidence became the evidence. That is an incredibly powerful psychological trick, and unfortunately, it still works today. Lustig reportedly invited the businessmen to inspect the Eiffel Tower, and this was another brilliant move, because once they physically stood beneath the tower, the imaginary transactions started to feel real. They're looking at thousands of tons of metal. They're imagining crews dismantling it. They're calculating scrap prices. They're thinking about transportation. They're thinking about labor. And most importantly, they're calculating their profit. At this point, the question inside their mind is no longer, is the Eiffel Tower really being sold? The question becomes, how do I make sure I get this contract? And that's a completely different psychological position. And Lustig began studying the men. He wasn't simply looking for the richest bidder. He needed the right victim. Someone ambitious, someone eager, someone who wanted to move up, someone who might be willing to ignore a few warning signs because the opportunity was simply too good. According to the famous version of the story, Lustig settled on a scrap metal dealer named Andre Poisson. Poisson wanted the deal, but there was reportedly a small problem. His wife was suspicious. Something didn't feel right. And this is the point where many scams collapse. A second person enters the situation. Someone who isn't emotionally invested in the opportunity. Someone who isn't thinking about money. Someone who simply looks at the facts and says, this doesn't make sense. Lustig needed to eliminate that doubt. So instead of defending himself, he changed the story. Lustig reportedly met privately with Poisson and began hinting that he was an underpaid government employee. And government employees sometimes expected a little something extra to make things happen. In other words, a bribe. Now think about what just happened. The suspicious behavior itself became proof that the deal was real. Why is this government official acting strange? Because he's corrupt. Why does he want secrecy? Because he's taking a bribe. Why does he want money outside the normal transaction? Because that's how government deals supposedly work, behind closed doors. The scam became more believable because it became less legitimate. And Poisson reportedly paid him. He handed over money for the Eiffel Tower deal and paid Lustig an additional bribe on top of it. Victor Lustig had done it. He had sold the Eiffel Tower, a monument he didn't own, a monument that wasn't for sale, a monument sitting in the middle of Paris. But now came the dangerous part, getting away. Lustig took the money and fled Paris. Reportedly, he went to Vienna, and then he waited, because eventually Poisson was going to discover the truth. There would be no demolition contract, no government sale, no Eiffel Tower scrap, nothing. Lustig expected police to come looking for him. He expected his face to appear everywhere in all the newspapers. He expected one of the most embarrassing scams imaginable to become national news. But something strange happened. Nothing. The story didn't explode, and according to accounts of the scam, Lustig realized why. Poisson was embarrassed. Think about it. What was he supposed to tell the police? I gave a stranger a large amount of money because I thought he was going to secretly sell me the Eiffel Tower. And then I also allegedly bribed him. For a businessman trying to establish himself, the humiliation could be devastating. So according to traditional tellings, Poisson stayed quiet, and that silence gave Victor Lustig an idea so outrageous that it almost doesn't seem possible. If nobody knows the Eiffel Tower scam happened, then technically the Eiffel Tower could still be for sale. So Lustig returned to Paris, and then he tried to do it again. New scrap dealers, new invitations, same Eiffel Tower. Imagine the confidence required to return to the city where you just committed the scam and then attempt to sell the exact same monument again. But this time, something went wrong. One of the potential victims became suspicious and reportedly contacted the authorities. Lustig realized the scheme was falling apart, and once again, he disappeared. He left France, but he didn't stop being Victor Lustig. Fast forward a few more years, and now he's in America. Lustig eventually operated extensively in the United States. And by this point, we're dealing with a man who had spent years studying one of the most valuable things in business, human incentives. What makes somebody say yes? What makes somebody ignore risk? What makes somebody trust? What makes somebody greedy? What makes somebody afraid of missing an opportunity? Those questions are at the center of legitimate sales and entrepreneurship. But they're also at the center of fraud. The difference is what you do with the knowledge. Lustig used it to deceive people. And one of the most famous stories associated with him involves one of America's most notorious gangsters, Al Capone. According to the often repeated story, Lustig approached Capone and asked him for around $50,000 for an investment opportunity. Now, scamming ordinary businessmen is one thing, but trying to scam Al Capone is something completely different. This is a man whose organization was associated with murder, bootlegging, gambling, and organized crime. If you steal $50,000 from Al Capone, you're probably not going to receive a strongly worded letter from his attorney. But Lustig reportedly had a different plan. He didn't invest the money, he simply held on to it. And then after a period of time, he returned the entire $50,000 to Capone. He supposedly told him that the deal hadn't worked, and because he couldn't deliver what he promised, he was returning every dollar. Think about how unusual that would have been. Capone was probably surrounded by people trying to take something from him all the time. But here's a man returning $50,000. Lustig had established himself as honest. And according to the story, Capone was so impressed, he gave Lustig several $1,000s as a reward. If that account is true, then Lustig had essentially run a con where the objective wasn't to steal the investment. The objective was to manufacture trust. He understood something sophisticated. Sometimes the easiest way to get someone's money is to first convince them that you don't want it. But Lustig's schemes eventually became much more serious. In the United States, he became involved in counterfeiting. And now we're no longer talking about convincing one businessman to purchase something imaginary. Counterfeiting attacks the financial system itself. Money works because people trust it. A $100 bill is just paper. The reason somebody will exchange food, clothing, labor, or property for that paper is because everyone agrees that it represents value. Counterfeiting exploits that trust. And Lustig became involved in a counterfeiting operation that attracted the attention of the federal authority. Fast forward to the mid-1930s. His luck was running out. After years of aliases, years of scams, years of moving from place to place, Lustig finally got arrested. And even then, the story wasn't finished. Because Lustig reportedly escaped custody, he was eventually captured again. This time, the government wasn't letting him disappear. He was convicted on federal charges and ultimately sent to one of the most famous prisons in America, Alcatraz. The man who had talked businessmen into buying the Eiffel Tower had finally reached a place he couldn't talk his way out of. Victor Lustig spent the final years of his life in prison. He died in 1947. He was 57 years old. And when you look at his life, there's a strange contradiction. Lustig clearly had the abilities that could have made him very successful in legitimate business. He understood sales. He understood positioning. He understood human psychology. He understood negotiation. He understood presentation. He understood information asymmetry. He understood scarcity. He understood urgency. He understood status. He understood greed. And perhaps most importantly, he understood perception. Those are incredibly valuable skills. But instead of building something, he used them to extract. And eventually, the system caught up with him. But there's another reason Victor Lustig's story survived. Because the Eiffel Tower scam reveals something uncomfortable about money. Victor Lustig never really sold the Eiffel Tower. Think about it. The buyer never possessed the tower. Lustig couldn't transfer ownership. He couldn't produce legitimate documents. He couldn't legally deliver the product. But what did Andre Poisson actually pay for? He paid for a story about opportunity. And that story changed the perceived value of everything around him. Yesterday, the Eiffel Tower was a tourist attraction. Today, it's thousands of tons of potentially profitable scrap metal. Yesterday, Victor Lustig was a stranger. Today, he's the government official who controls access to the deal. Yesterday, keeping quiet would seem a little strange. Today, secrecy means you're a part of an exclusive group. Lustig changed the context. And once he changed the context, he changed how people valued everything inside it. That's something legitimate entrepreneurs understand too. A bottle of water might cost $1 at the grocery store. At the airport, it's going to be $3 to $4. And at a luxury hotel, way more than that. Same water, different context. A piece of fabric might cost $20. Put the right designer's name on it, and suddenly somebody pays $500. A piece of land nobody wants can become extremely valuable when somebody announces a major development nearby. Value isn't determined only by what something physically is. Value is also determined by scarcity, access, timing, trust, information, status, and expectation. Lustig understood all of these things. He just used them dishonestly. But there's another character in this story that doesn't get enough attention. Greed. Lustig needed his victims to want something too. He couldn't simply walk up to Poisson and say, "Hey, give me your money." There had to be a reason, a profit, an advantage, a secret, an opportunity that everybody else didn't know about. And that's where greed became dangerous. Because the moment we desperately want something to be true, we become much easier to convince that it is true. Think about how many financial scams still use this exact same formula. I have an investment nobody knows about. I have an access ordinary people don't have. You have to move quickly. Don't tell anybody. This opportunity won't last. I know somebody on the inside. You're getting in before everybody else. Different century, different technology, but same psychology. Victor Lustig didn't invent greed. He simply learned how to monetize it. There are two completely different ways to study someone like Victor Lustig. The first is to admire the scam. That's the wrong lesson. The second is to study the mechanics. That's where things become interesting. Because Lustig understood that people don't buy purely based on facts. They buy based on belief. He created authority through appearance. He created scarcity through exclusivity. He created urgency through a supposedly limited government sale. He created social proof by inviting multiple businessmen. He created value by showing them the physical tower. He removed objections by explaining why the transaction had to remain secret. And when suspicion appeared, he didn't argue against it. He incorporated the suspicion into the story. That is extraordinarily sophisticated persuasion. The problem was that the entire thing was built on a lie. A legitimate entrepreneur uses persuasion to help someone understand real value. A con man uses persuasion to manufacture value that doesn't exist. The distinction matters because trust compounds just like money. Build trust for 20 years and your reputation can become one of your most valuable assets. Destroy it and sometimes no amount of money can buy it back. Victor Lustig made money quickly, but he never built wealth that could survive without Victor Lustig constantly finding another victim. There was no company, no productive asset, no institution, no invention, no real customer base, no legacy business, just another scam, and then another, and then another, until eventually there was nowhere left to run. Almost a century later, the Eiffel Tower is still standing. Millions of people visit it. They take pictures underneath it. They propose marriage beside it. They travel across the world just to see it. And most of them have absolutely no idea that in 1925, a man reportedly convinced somebody that the entire thing was about to be dismantled and sold for scrap. Victor Lustig didn't own the Eiffel Tower. He didn't build it. He didn't control it. He couldn't legally sell a single piece of it. But for a brief moment, he controlled something almost as valuable: the story surrounding it. And somebody believed that story strongly enough to hand him money. That's what makes the story of Victor Lustig so fascinating. It isn't really a story about the Eiffel Tower. It's a story about value, trust, greed, opportunity, and perception, and the incredible lengths that people will go when they believe they've discovered a financial opportunity nobody else knows about. Victor Lustig sold the Eiffel Tower without ever owning it. He got away. Then, according to the famous story, he came back and tried to sell it again. If there's one thing his story proves, it's this. Sometimes the most valuable thing being sold isn't the product. It's the belief that the opportunity is real. It takes me hours to do the research and put these stories together. If you enjoyed this story, then the one thing that I ask is that you subscribe, like, and drop a comment. It's completely free, but it helps the channel immensely. This is the Life or Debt Show, where we explore stories about wealth, ambition, and human nature. My name is Inni, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.